An elderly black veteran adopted an abandoned young black girl. 16 years later, she saved his life. The handcuffs cut into his wrists, but Elijah Combs did not flinch. 68 years old, back straight as a rifle, he stood in the orange jumpsuit they had given him 3 days earlier, and he stared straight ahead at the flag hanging behind the judge's bench. He had saluted that flag in Vietnam. He had bled for it in a rice paddy outside Da Nang, and now it hung above a courtroom that was about to decide whether a decorated veteran was a criminal. Behind him, the gallery murmured. Some of the faces were neighbors who had known him for 20 years. Some were strangers who had only read the headline, "Local man charged in warehouse fire, 2 injured." Nobody in that gallery yet knew the whole truth. Nobody yet understood what Elijah Combs had actually done that night, or why he had done it, or who was about to walk through the courtroom doors to defend him. But they were about to find out. Elijah had built his life out of almost nothing. Born in 1957 in a small town in Alabama, the son of sharecroppers, he grew up picking cotton before he grew up doing much of anything else. His father died when Elijah was 9. Worked to death, the doctor said, though everyone knew what that really meant in a place where a black man's exhaustion was never taken seriously until it killed him. His mother raised 5 children alone, cleaning houses during the day and taking in laundry at night, and she told Elijah the same thing every single morning before he left for the fields. "You are worth something, even when this world tells you different. Don't you ever forget that." He carried those words through 18 years of hardship. Through a segregated school system that gave him half the books and none of the encouragement. Through the day, the draft board sent a letter that changed everything. Vietnam took him at 19 and gave him back a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, a permanent limp, and nightmares that never fully stopped. It also gave him something else. A sense that he had already survived the worst thing a man could survive, and that whatever life demanded of him afterward, he would meet it standing up. He came home in 1972 to a country that thanked him with words and closed doors when he looked for work. He was turned away from 3 factory jobs before a foreman named Walt Peterson. A white man who had also served looked past the color of Elijah's skin and saw the discipline in his posture and gave him a chance on the loading dock. Elijah worked that warehouse for 31 years, never missing a shift, training 100 younger men. He retired as floor supervisor, respected by everyone who worked under him, and thought his story was mostly finished, a hard life, honestly lived, quietly closing. Then, on a rainy October evening in 2008, everything changed again. He was walking home from the corner store, a bag of groceries in one hand, when he heard it, a thin, high sound coming from behind the dumpsters behind the old laundromat. At first, he thought it was a cat. He almost kept walking, but something made him stop, made him set the groceries down and push aside a piece of soaked cardboard. And there she was, a baby girl, no more than a few days old, wrapped in a threadbare towel, shivering, alone. Elijah stood there in the rain for a long moment, staring down at that tiny face, and he thought about his mother's words. "You are worth something, even when this world tells you different." He picked her up. He carried her 3 blocks to the fire station instead of calling it in from where he stood. Because some part of him, the part that had survived a war and 30 years of quiet dignity, refused to leave her alone for even the few minutes it would take help to arrive. The firefighters called social services. Social services called the county. And somewhere in that chain of phone calls, something unusual happened. Elijah Combs, 68 years old, widowed for 6 years, with no other children and a modest pension, asked if he could be the one to take her home. Everyone told him he was too old. The caseworker, a tired woman named Diane Ruiz, sat across from him at a metal table and said, as gently as she could, "Mr. Combs, in 18 years, you'll be 86. Have you thought about that?" "I've thought about the 18 years before this one too," he told her. "I thought I was done being useful. Turns out I wasn't." It took 4 months of home visits, background checks, and a hearing in front of a family court judge who looked at Elijah's age and his modest one-bedroom house and hesitated. But Elijah showed up to every appointment in a pressed shirt. He converted his spare room into a nursery with money he didn't really have. He learned to warm bottles and change diapers at an age when most men were learning to manage arthritis, and eventually, in the spring of 2009, the court granted him full legal guardianship, and later formal adoption. He named her Naomi. The years that followed were not easy, but they were full. Elijah raised Naomi on a fixed income in a neighborhood that was slowly emptying out as jobs left and buildings closed. He worked odd jobs after retirement, fixing lawnmowers, doing security shifts at the community center to keep her in decent shoes and books. He walked her to school every morning until she was old enough to insist she didn't need him to, and even then, he watched from the porch until she turned the corner. He taught her to read using an old set of encyclopedias he'd bought at a yard sale, 1 volume at a time, and by the time she was 7, she was reading 2 grades ahead of her class. But the world did not always look kindly on an elderly black man raising a little girl who wasn't his by blood. There were whispers at the grocery store. There were teachers who assumed wrongly that a girl from that kind of household needed extra discipline rather than extra encouragement. There was a school counselor who once suggested, without any real evidence, that perhaps Naomi should be evaluated for behavioral issues simply because she had spoken up in class about something she believed was unfair. Elijah sat through every one of those meetings with his hat in his lap and his spine straight, never raising his voice, always asking the same quiet question: "Have you actually looked at her work? Have you actually listened to what she said?" Naomi noticed. Even as a small child, she noticed the way people's eyes would flick toward her grandfather. She called him Grandpa, though there was no blood between them, with a kind of suspicious pity, as if his age and his skin and his modest clothes were a kind of accusation. She noticed how hard he worked to never give anyone a reason to take her away from him. And she decided, somewhere around the age of 10, that she was going to spend her life making sure nobody ever looked at him that way again. She started reading his old military records, which he kept in a metal box in his closet, not because he'd shown her, he almost never talked about the war, but because she was curious about who he had been before her. She found his Purple Heart citation. She found letters from men he'd served with, thanking him for pulling them out of a burning transport in 1970. She began quietly to understand that the man raising her on a fixed pension, who fixed lawnmowers for grocery money, had once run through gunfire to save 3 other soldiers' lives, and had never once mentioned it to anyone in the neighborhood. "Why didn't you ever tell me this?" she asked him one night when she was 13, holding the citation in her hands. Elijah looked at the paper for a long moment. "Because a man doesn't do the right thing so people will know about it later," he said. "He does it because it's right, that's all." Naomi carried that sentence with her for the rest of her life. She excelled in school, despite every low expectation placed on her. She was the first in her graduating class to be accepted into a pre-law program, and she chose to specialize in criminal defense, in part because of every unfair meeting she had watched her grandfather endure without ever losing his composure. She wanted to be the person standing beside people the world had already decided to judge. By the time Naomi was 22, she was in her 2nd year of law school, working part-time at a public defender's office, still calling Elijah every single Sunday, still driving the 2 hours home whenever she had a break long enough to make the trip. He was 78 by then, slower on his feet, his limp more pronounced but still sharp, still proud, still living in the same modest house with the same nursery room that had long since become an office full of her old school trophies and photographs. And then came the night that would test everything he had built his whole life to protect. It started with a fire. The warehouse where Elijah had worked for 31 years had been sold years earlier to a logistics company that used it for storage. On a cold December night, a fire broke out in the loading bay, an electrical fault, investigators would later determine, in wiring that had been improperly maintained by the new owners to cut costs. 2 overnight security guards were injured trying to escape the smoke. The fire caused significant damage before it was finally put out. Elijah had nothing to do with any of it. He hadn't set foot in that warehouse in over 15 years. But he had, 3 weeks earlier, filed a formal complaint with the city about the very same electrical wiring, after noticing sparking near an outdoor junction box while walking past the building on his evening walk. An old habit from his days as floor supervisor, checking on the building out of a lifelong sense of responsibility, even after he no longer worked there. The complaint was on record, his name and signature were on it. When the fire happened, and the company that owned the warehouse needed someone to blame, besides their own negligence, their lawyers found that complaint in the city records and built a theory out of it. That Elijah Combs, a disgruntled former employee, had deliberately sabotaged the electrical system out of some imagined grievance, and that his complaint had actually been an attempt to cover his tracks in advance. It was absurd. It was also, to Elijah's horror, enough to get him arrested. The company's insurance carrier was facing a massive payout, and their lawyers needed a narrative that shifted liability away from their client's negligence. An elderly black man with a decades-old employment history at the site, a documented complaint that could be twisted into prior knowledge, and no immediate alibi for the exact hour of the fire because he'd been asleep alone in his house. It was enough circumstantial material for an ambitious young prosecutor named Bradley Kessler to bring formal charges, arson and reckless endangerment. Elijah sat in a holding cell for 3 days before Naomi even learned what had happened. He hadn't wanted to worry her during finals week. When she finally got the call from a neighbor, she left her exam room, drove 2 hours through the night, and walked into the county jail, still wearing her law school hoodie. "Grandpa," she said, her hands pressed against the glass. "Grandpa, what happened?" "I'm all right, baby girl," he told her, and even now, even facing decades in prison at nearly 70 years old, his voice did not shake. "I didn't do this. You know I didn't do this." "I know," she said. "I know you didn't, but knowing wasn't enough. The court had already appointed him a public defender, an overworked, underpaid attorney named Trevor Alsop, who was handling 11 other cases that same week, and who told Elijah in their first 15-minute meeting that a plea deal for a reduced sentence might be his best option given the circumstances. "There are no circumstances," Elijah said quietly. "I didn't do it. Mr. Combs, I understand, but juries can be unpredictable, and given your age, a plea might mean—" "I fought for this country," Elijah said, and for the first time in years, Naomi heard something break slightly in his voice. "I raised a daughter alone at 70 years old. I have never in my life taken something that wasn't mine, or hurt something I didn't build. I will not stand up in a courtroom and say I did something I didn't do, not even to save myself." Naomi stood outside that meeting room and felt something crystallize inside her that had been forming since she was 10 years old, holding a Purple Heart citation in her hands. She was still 18 months from finishing her law degree. She was not yet licensed to practice, but she knew with absolute certainty that she was not going to let her grandfather sit in a courtroom represented by a man who was already halfway to giving up. She withdrew from 2 of her classes that semester, a decision that would cost her a scholarship stipend she desperately needed, and she spent every waking hour in the law library and in the public records office. She was not yet a lawyer, but she was by then one of the most capable legal researchers her professors had ever supervised, and she convinced Elijah's newly assigned senior public defender, a seasoned but exhausted attorney named Patricia Kwan, to let her work under her direct supervision as a certified legal intern, gathering evidence, drafting motions, and preparing the case file line by line. For 6 months, Naomi lived 2 lives, finishing her final semester of law school by day, building her grandfather's defense by night. She pulled maintenance records from the city archives, showing that the warehouse's new owners had received 3 prior citations for the exact same electrical violations Elijah had reported, all of which they had ignored to avoid the cost of repairs. She found the original inspector's report, buried, uncatalogued, nearly lost, that confirmed the fire's point of origin was consistent with the failing junction box Elijah had flagged 3 weeks before the blaze, not with any act of sabotage. She tracked down 2 former warehouse employees, laid off after the sale, who were willing to testify that the new management had a documented pattern of disregarding safety complaints to protect their margins. But the most important discovery came almost by accident, 4 months into the investigation, when Naomi was reviewing the company's insurance claim filings and noticed a name she recognized from an old photograph in her grandfather's metal box. A supervisor named Walter Peterson Jr., the son of the very foreman who had given Elijah his first job on the loading dock 50 years earlier. Walter Jr. now worked as a compliance officer for the logistics company, and buried in an internal email thread obtained through a subpoena Patricia Kwan had fought for weeks to secure, was a message from 3 weeks before the fire in which Walter Jr. had personally warned upper management in writing that the junction box near the loading bay needed emergency repair before someone gets hurt or we get sued. Management's response, also in writing, was to defer the repair to the following fiscal quarter to protect that year's budget projections. The company had known. They had known before Elijah ever filed his complaint, and they had chosen to do nothing. And then, when the fire they had ignored finally happened, they had reached for the nearest convenient scapegoat rather than admit their own negligence. The trial began on a grey morning in March. Elijah walked into that courtroom in the same orange jumpsuit he had worn for 3 days at the start of this ordeal. The county had not seen fit to grant him bail, citing flight risk for a 70-year-old man with a limp who had lived in the same house for 40 years and had never missed a single doctor's appointment in his life. He sat at the defense table, handcuffed, facing a gallery that included curious neighbors, a few reporters covering what the local paper had dubbed the warehouse arson case, and the confident, well-dressed legal team of the logistics company's insurer, sitting behind the prosecutor as though they already knew how this would end. But they didn't know what was coming. Because on the second day of trial, after the prosecution had presented its circumstantial theory, the complaint, the employment history, the lack of alibi, the courtroom doors opened and Naomi Combs walked in. She was 23 years old, freshly graduated, still 6 weeks from receiving her bar exam results, wearing the one good black suit she owned, carrying a leather briefcase she had bought second-hand for this exact moment. Patricia Kwan had petitioned the court for special permission to allow Naomi, as a certified legal intern under close supervision, to conduct the direct examination of 2 key witnesses, a request the judge, impressed by the thoroughness of the defense's motions over the preceding months, had granted. The gallery murmured as she walked down the aisle. Some recognized her as that girl Elijah Combs took in years back. Others simply saw a young woman in a black suit walking toward the front of the courtroom with the calm, deliberate steps of someone who had spent 16 years learning what it meant to stand your ground with dignity, no matter who was watching, no matter who doubted you. Elijah, sitting at the defense table in his handcuffs and his prison uniform, did not turn his head as she passed. But those who were close enough saw his jaw tighten, saw something shift in his posture. Not fear, not surprise, but a kind of quiet, overwhelming pride that no orange jumpsuit could diminish. Naomi called Walter Peterson Jr. to the stand. She walked him, methodically, and without a single wasted word, through the internal email chain the defense had subpoenaed. She asked him to read his own warning aloud to the jury before someone gets hurt or we get sued, and then asked him to read management's response deferring the repair. She asked him whether he had ever met Elijah Combs. He said yes, years ago, as a boy, when his father ran the loading dock. She asked him what his father had told him about that man. "My father said Elijah Combs was the most honest man he ever hired," Walter Jr. said quietly. "Said he never missed a day, never cut a corner, never let a piece of equipment go unrepaired if he thought it was a danger to the men working under him." "And is it true?" Naomi asked, her voice steady, though her hands, hidden behind the podium, were trembling, "that the man being tried for allegedly sabotaging that warehouse is the same man your own company's internal records show tried 3 separate times to warn the city about the exact hazard that ultimately caused this fire?" "Objection," the prosecutor said, leading. "Sustained. Rephrase." Naomi rephrased. The answer came out the same way regardless. Yes. She called the former inspector next, who confirmed under oath that the fire's origin was fully consistent with the failing junction box, and inconsistent with any deliberate accelerant or sabotage. She called the 2 laid-off employees, who described a company culture that treated safety complaints as inconveniences rather than warnings. By the time she sat down after her closing argument on the final day of trial, an argument she had rewritten 14 times in the 6 months leading up to that morning. An argument that spoke not only to the facts of the case, but to the 50 years of quiet dignity the man at the defense table had lived. An argument that ended with the line, "My grandfather taught me that a man does the right thing, not because someone will find out, but because it's right." And the right thing today is to see this man for who he actually is, not who it was convenient to blame. There was not a dry eye in the jury box. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, not guilty on all counts. The gallery erupted, not in the chaotic way of courtroom dramas, but in something quieter and more profound. A long exhale, scattered applause that the judge did not bother to silence, and Elijah Combs, 70 years old, finally free of his handcuffs, standing slowly at the defense table and turning to look at the granddaughter who had just spent 6 months of her life and every ounce of her training, proving to the world what he had always known about himself. Naomi crossed the small distance between the podium and the defense table and wrapped her arms around him. And for the first time in this entire ordeal, in front of the jury, the judge, the reporters, and the very lawyers who had tried to send him to prison, Elijah Combs allowed himself to cry. The consequences that followed were real, and they were proportional. The district attorney's office, embarrassed by how close it had come to convicting an innocent 70-year-old veteran on evidence that collapsed the moment it was properly examined, opened an internal review of the case that led to new charging guidelines requiring corroborating physical evidence, not just circumstantial narrative, before pursuing arson charges against individuals with documented safety complaints on file. The logistics company, facing the exposure of its own internal emails, settled a civil suit with the 2 injured security guards for a sum large enough to make headlines, and separately paid Elijah a settlement for wrongful prosecution that, while it could never undo 3 days in a holding cell or 6 months of fear, allowed him to finally retire completely without ever touching a lawnmower for grocery money again. Walter Peterson Jr., to his credit, resigned from the company rather than continue working for an organization that had used his own safety warning as a weapon against an innocent man, and later testified before a city council hearing on warehouse safety regulations, citing Elijah's case directly. Naomi passed her bar exam 2 months later. She was offered a position at 3 different firms, including one prestigious corporate defense practice that offered a starting salary nearly triple what public defense paid. She turned all 3 down. She took a job instead at the same overworked public defender's office where Patricia Kwan still worked, in the same building where a tired attorney had once told her grandfather that a plea deal might be his best option, because she had decided, somewhere in those 6 months, that there were too many people who looked like her grandfather sitting in cells with attorneys who had 11 other cases that same week, and that the debt she owed the world for what he had given her could only be repaid by standing in that same gap for someone else. Elijah did not need saving in the way that action movies imagine saving. No gunfights, no last-minute chases. He needed someone to believe he was worth defending the way he had once believed a stranger's abandoned newborn was worth carrying home in the rain. 16 years after he picked her up from behind a dumpster, Naomi Combs walked into a courtroom and gave that same belief back to him, multiplied by every year of discipline, education, and love he had poured into her. He still lives in the same house, though Naomi had the wiring fully redone over his objections the month after the trial ended. He still walks to the corner store most mornings, slower now, his cane in one hand. And most Sundays, when Naomi drives the 2 hours home, they sit on that same porch where he once watched a little girl disappear around the corner on her way to school. And they don't talk about the trial much anymore. They talk about her cases now, the people she's defending, the ones the world has already decided to judge before it bothers to listen. "You did good, baby girl," he tells her most Sundays, in some form or another. "I learned from the best," she always answers. And somewhere in that house, in the same metal box he once kept in his closet, there is now a second citation beside his Purple Heart. Not a medal, but a printed copy of a jury's verdict. Not guilty on all counts, framed by Naomi herself, hanging on the wall of the office that used to be a nursery, a reminder to anyone who walks through that door of exactly what it looks like when someone finally gets to stand up in front of the world and be recognized for who they always were. If this story moved you, remember this: dignity does not announce itself. Somewhere near you, right now, there is a person the world has already decided not to see clearly. Look again. If it touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.